The serpent in the garden was actually Jesus? Get this, an ancient book banned by the church reveals who the serpent actually is, who God is, who Jesus is, who the devil is, and what the Garden of Eden really meant, and most importantly, what you really are. And it's nothing like you've been told. Sometimes you have to turn things upside down to see them clearly, because this story, this isn't about ancient people in the garden with fig leaves. This is about a cosmic cover-up, about the difference between blind obedience and awakening, about a false god who lied and a serpent who revealed the truth. Now, you know the classic Eden story, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the one rule about not eating from the tree of knowledge, a wise serpent, and a very unhappy God when he finds out that they break the rule. It's often called the fall of man, the original sin, blah, blah, blah. But have you ever really listened to the story? I mean, really paid attention to its details? Because buried in this ancient tale are some insane details that got under the skin of some early Christians so bad, they believed that it revealed a dark truth about God. My name is Morgue. I'm an ex-Christian revealing hidden knowledge to make enlightenment go viral. And today we're exposing the truth about the connection between Jesus and the serpent. Okay, so first you know the story. God creates a perfect garden, sticks the first humans there, basically says, hey, have fun kids, but don't touch that one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you're gonna die that very day. In fact, Genesis 2:17 says, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. Okay, got it? Disobey equals death the same day. Then enter the serpent, crafty and apparently not a fan of these weird rules. The serpent tells Eve a very different story. In fact, the snake flat out contradicts God, saying, you will not surely die. The serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. All right, whoa, so the snake is basically saying, nah, you're not gonna die. Instead, you'll wake up and your eyes will open and you'll become godlike in knowledge. So we have these two opposite claims here. God says, eat and die. Serpent says, eat and you'll gain wisdom, not die. Now, only one of these can be true, right? It's like the ultimate he said, she said, or rather he said, snake said. It's almost like a riddle. Who's telling the truth here, God or the serpent? What if this story was a kind of intelligence test or a soul test? All right, so even Adam, they eat the fruit because let's face it, who wouldn't be curious after that sales pitch? So what happens when they do? God said that they would die that very day. Do they? Lightning bolt to the head, maybe? No, they don't die. Not that day, not the next day, not the next century. Adam lives, in fact, to 930 freaking years old. Yeah, don't get me started on how crazy that is. Now, not only do they not die on the spot, but God literally admits the snake was right. Genesis 3:22 says, and the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. All right, excuse me? Why does nobody talk about this? God just admitted that humanity leveled up exactly like the serpent said they would. I remember reading that story as a kid and it never made any sense to me. The only thing God seems to be concerned about now is preventing them from eating from the other magic tree, the tree of life, and becoming immortal. So he kicks them out of Eden to block access to the immortality fruit. Now, don't you think it's pretty sus that God doesn't want them to have knowledge or eternal life? I mean, what the fuck? Okay, time out here, because we need to check the receipts. God said, you'll die the day you eat that fruit. The serpent said, you won't die. You'll gain knowledge and become godlike. The result? They didn't die that day. They did gain knowledge, and God himself says, behold, the man has become like one of us. Hello? Am I the only one seeing a bit of a problem here? Because one of these two, God or the snake, lied, or at least very severely misled someone, and it sure wasn't the snake, and God's looking like fake news. This is the part where many traditional Bible readers start stammering, okay, well, God meant spiritually die, or that they would die eventually, or it's a metaphor. All right, sure, maybe, but the text of Genesis itself, read straight, kind of makes God look wrong, or at the very least, extremely misleading. Meanwhile, the snake, the one the church says is the ultimate deceiver, comes across like the only honest character in the whole damn story. And if that doesn't raise an eyebrow for you, you might not be paying attention. Are you actually reading the story critically? Or are you just following what authority figures tell you about who the real bad guy is here? Seriously, what if this story serves as a kind of cosmic IQ test to see if you're awake enough to question the narrative? Now, as we'll soon find out, that's exactly how a book banned by the church presents it, because this whole story story bothered people way back in ancient times too. The earliest Christians didn't just shrug and accept the party line. Some of them noticed and they started asking, well, hold on, if the snake told the truth and humans gained knowledge, making them godlike, what's really going on in this story? Who's the bad guy and who's the good guy here? So these Christians who questioned the story, these ancient spiritual rebels, eventually became known as gnostics, meaning those who know, because they were all about knowledge. Gnosis means knowledge in Greek, and they had a totally radical and different interpretation of the story of the Garden of Eden, the kind of interpretation that eventually got them branded as heretics or even killed. See, many Gnostics believed that the serpent wasn't the devil, that the serpent was Christ in disguise, trying to help humanity escape from a fake world. They believed that it was the so-called creator, the false, lying God who was actually the devil. Let me say that again. The snake wasn't the devil. The creator was. All right, so who were these Gnostics anyway? Well, they were Christians that believed that salvation didn't come from following rules like obedient little sheep. It came from waking up, from inner knowledge. And waking up to what exactly? To what you really are, where you come from, and what the universe is really about. And to the Gnostics, the world as we see it was like the upside down from Stranger Things. And that the real God, the true God, was way above and beyond this broken world, a being of pure light, the source itself, the so-called creator of the physical world, the one described in Genesis that demands obedience, threatening death, spewing jealousy. They believed he was a false god, a cosmic fraud. They even had a name for him, the demiurge, which literally means craftsman in Greek. But this craftsman wasn't making IKEA furniture. He was building a spiritual prison. And they accused him of being arrogant, jealous, and cruel. Does that sound kind of familiar? Think about it. In the Bible, in Exodus 20:3-5, God says, "You shall have no other gods before me, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children of the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation." Okay, hold up here. Punishing the children for the sins of their great-great-grandpa? We're gonna get to that in a minute, trust me. But what about this whole jealousy thing? In a Gnostic text called the Secret Book of John, Jesus points out that if the creator says, "I am a jealous God," he's admitting that other gods exists. I mean, who is he jealous of? The Gnostics weren't afraid to call out contradictions. All right, but who was this demiurge? And if the creator is evil and the serpent told the truth, where does Jesus fit into all this? One of the most explosive writings that survives from these early Christian rebels is a text that scholars call the Testimony of Truth. And it's basically a Gnostic flamethrower. It was lost for almost 1600 years because the church banned it, but it was discovered in 1945, dug up near the tombs in the Egyptian desert. And now it's back and we're blowing it up on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. We're going viral with the knowledge that they tried to erase. The Testimony of Truth is basically a text tearing apart the beliefs of what it calls foolish Christians, and it goes off about the Garden of Eden. The Testimony of Truth does not tiptoe around this. It attacks the Genesis account to expose what it says is the real truth hiding there, and it dissects it line by line, going full-on detective mode, like some spiritual true crime Genesis edition where God is the prime suspect. But right from the beginning, the Testimony of Truth tells some of its readers, you can't handle the truth.
I want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
The Testimony of Truth says, "I will address those who know how to pay heed, not with the ears of the body, but with the ears of the heart, because many there are who have looked for the truth but could not find it." In other words, this is for the seekers, the questioners, the heretics, the ones with ears that actually hear. So what does the Testimony of Truth actually say? Well, this text does not take the garden story at face value like mainstream religion does. It doesn't say, well, God said it, so it must be true. No. This text reads between the lines, notices the contradictions, and calls God out. In other words, it examines the story critically using logic and reason. And it all starts with the serpent, who even the Bible calls the wisest of all the animals. So let's take a look at the story and then tell me, do you think the serpent is more like Christ or the devil? The Testimony of Truth says, "The serpent was cleverer than all the other animals in paradise, and he convinced Eve by saying, 'On the day you eat of the tree in the middle of paradise, the eyes of your mind will be opened.'" The eyes of your mind, not your flesh, not your ego, your mind. That's awakening, not temptation. He's saying, wake up, see reality, become aware. And so then what happens? They eat and they don't die. Their eyes are opened exactly as the serpent said. And the so-called God shows up, and what does he do? When, however, Adam saw God, he hid himself, and he asked, "Adam, where are you?" All right, what? Adam, where are you? Doesn't that seem like a weird thing for a God to ask? Is this a divine being or your drunk uncle yelling in the backyard at midnight? Okay, we're gonna come back to this because the testimony of truth goes off on it, but it gets stranger. The testimony of truth points out that this God doesn't try to enlighten Adam, doesn't guide him, doesn't even have a calm conversation. No, he gets jealous. Is this sounding like an all-loving, all-knowing God or an insecure narcissist that lost his keys? The text says, God cursed the serpent and called him devil, and he said, behold, Adam has become like one of us, knowing evil and good. All right, there's a few things going on here. First, the testimony of truth is pointing out that this so-called God admits the serpent was right. But notice how it says he called the serpent the devil? But guess what? That isn't even in the Bible. So let that sink in. There is no verse in Genesis that says the serpent is the devil. Christians didn't start claiming that until way later. So the testimony of truth is calling BS on what would later become Christian dogma. It's literally saying, hey, they made this part up. That wasn't Satan, that was slander. Propaganda, disinformation. But the testimony of truth, it's just getting started. God then said, let us cast him out of paradise in case he takes from the tree of life, eats and lives forever. But what kind of God is that? First, he was jealous of Adam, that he ate of the tree of knowledge. Jealous of Adam. Not angry that Adam sinned, jealous that Adam gained knowledge. Well, that's the first red flag. And the testimony of truth says, what kind of God is that? And you can feel the sarcasm coming off the page, saying what kind of supreme being throws a cosmic tantrum because someone got a little too smart. The text is trying to get the reader to realize that, maybe this God isn't God at all. Then the text goes for round two. Second, however, he asked, Adam, where are you? But then God does not have knowledge beforehand. Specifically, he did not know from the beginning. All right, so you mean to tell me this all-powerful, all-knowing deity just lost a game of hide and seek? What the fuck? Did God forget to slap an air tag on him? So again, the author is asking us, what kind of God is that? Shouldn't a real God know everything? Hello? Something's not adding up here. Afterwards, he said, let us cast him out of this place in case he eats from the tree of life and lives forever. There it is. It's about control. The so-called God is afraid that Adam might become even more powerful. In fact, the Gnostics believed Adam and Eve had the potential to become way more powerful than this false God, and he can't have that. So what does he do? He casts him out, and the testimony of truth hits another blow. Surely he has revealed himself to be maliciously jealous. And what kind of God is that? Yeah. Thank you. What kind of God is that? Because I'll tell you what he's not. He's not love, he's not wisdom, he's not divine in any sense of the word. I remember reading this years after leaving Christianity, the testimony of truth, and feeling totally vindicated. Hardly anyone realizes how obvious this is, and I'd spent years feeling like I was crazy for questioning everything. And then I find out there were entire communities 2,000 years ago saying, yeah, this God seems like a fake. Wake the hell up, people. And the testimony of truth isn't even making an emotional argument. It isn't yelling and flailing like a televangelist.
You get out, you break your power, you get out, break off this nation, I demand.
No, the testimony of truth is laying out a case using logic and reason. And that's the moment the Gnostics go, wait a second, if the serpent told the truth and God lied, who's the real deceiver here? The so-called God is a fake. He's not the father of light, he's the father of lies. He's the devil. In fact, it's so obvious, the testimony of truth says, because great is the blindness of those who read and they understand not. That's a warning. It's talking about people who read the scriptures but don't see what's right the hell in front of them. If you read Genesis and still think that the manipulative sky daddy is the hero, that's not faith, you're blind. Use your head, use logic, ask questions. He said, I am the jealous God. I will bring the sins of the fathers on the children up to 3 and 4 generations. Okay, so let me get this straight. You're gonna punish someone for what their great-great-grandpa did. Imagine that the cops show up at your door and are like, yeah, we're here because your ancestors stole a goat in 1742. Put your hands up. And here's the wild part. That line, it's not just in Gnostic texts. It's in the actual Bible, not once, 4 times. Twice in Exodus, once in Numbers, and once in Deuteronomy. That's not justice, that's total insanity. The text continues, and God said, I will make their heart thick, and I will cause their minds to become blind, so that they cannot understand or grasp the things that are said. He literally says he's gonna blind people's minds on purpose. Why? So they can't understand, so they can't wake up, so they stay obedient. And before anyone says, well, that's just in the Gnostic texts. Again, no, sorry, that's in the Bible too. In Isaiah 6:10, Deuteronomy 29:4, Romans 11:8, and here's the most messed up part. The testimony of truth points out, but these things he speaks to those who believe in him and who worship him. So in other words, he's not just doing all this to his enemies alone, he's even doing it to the people who believe in him. What kind of God is that? I remember being a kid and hearing God is love, and then in the next breath, he's gonna burn you forever in hell if you don't behave. Doesn't make any sense. But no one around me seemed to notice. They just zoned out and sang worship songs. The testimony of truth is trying to shake you awake. It's calling the God of Genesis a jealous, malicious entity who lied to keep humanity in spiritual darkness. In this view, ignorance is the real sin, and the serpent, far from being Satan, is the bringer of light and truth. Now do you see why the church tried to destroy this book and others like it? And now you're here, sitting with your phone, on your couch, maybe in bed, and you're unlocking secrets that once got people burned at the stake. You're literally part of what the church tried to kill off. And guess who benefits the most from keeping you blind and obedient? The text says, the Pharisees and scribes, however, belong to the archons who possess authority over them. In other words, the priests, the pastors, the mega church leaders with private jets, the ones who claim divine authority while selling you slavery. Well, the Gnostics saw right through that bullshit. They said these guys are owned by the archons. Well, who the hell are the archons? They're the dark servants of the false god who keep humanity in ignorance. And religion, mainstream religion, it's their perfect weapon. Why? Well, because it's obsessed with the law, commandments, rules, sin charts, purity codes. They treat the Bible like a legal document and God like some cosmic IRS agent. But the testimony of truth, it called that out too. No one who lives under obligation to the law can gaze upward to the truth, because the pollution of the law is apparent. Pollution, not holiness, not morality, pollution. Why? Because once you chain yourself to religious laws, you stop looking within. The laws of religion don't lead you to God. They lead you to a cell. So the testimony of truth is pretty clear that the God of Genesis is a satanic fraud. But what about the serpent? Was that really Jesus? And isn't Jesus supposed to be the son of the creator God? How does all that make sense? All right, well, check this out. The testimony of truth brings in another story that we know from the Bible. Let's talk about Numbers 21. The Israelites are wandering in the desert, whining about everything. And what does God do? He sends venomous snakes to bite them. Another dick move, but we probably shouldn't be surprised at this point. But then he tells Moses to make a bronze serpent on a pole, and if anyone looks at it, they'll be healed. So a serpent on a pole brings healing and life? Does that sound kind of familiar? Yeah, the Gnostics thought so too. The testimony of truth jumps on this story and flat out says, the one who will believe in this bronze serpent will be saved because this is Christ. It flat out says that Christ is the bronze serpent. And guess what? The Bible, yeah, even your grandma's King James Bible, says the same thing. Not only that, but Jesus says it himself. In John 3:14, Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Jesus flat out compares himself to the serpent. And if you're an Orthodox Christian saying, well, that's just a metaphor. Okay, sure, but the Gnostics, they saw a pattern. In Eden, the serpent gave knowledge. In the desert, the serpent gave healing. In the Gospels, Jesus is the serpent lifted up to save souls. And in Matthew 10:16, Jesus says, be wise as serpents. Why would he say that if serpents are pure evil? I mean, hell, they keep talking about how smart the serpent is. The testimony of truth practically shouts from the ancient pages, Christ is the true serpent, the embodiment of divine wisdom and knowledge. Okay, well, if Christ is the serpent and the God of Genesis is the real devil, how does that make sense if Jesus is supposed to be God's son? Well, the Gnostics believe Jesus came from the real God, who is a much higher being of pure light. Now, I did a whole video about that hidden God. You should go watch it. But let's go to the New Testament for a second. If the Gnostics are right, then when Jesus is called the Son of God, it means a messenger from the true being of pure light that the Gnostics called the one, not the creator God from the Old Testament, who the Gnostics saw as the devil. Well, check this out. In John 10:30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. But that's not all, because a few chapters earlier, in John 8:44, Jesus says the same thing as the Gnostics, that the father of the religious leaders is actually the devil. Jesus tells them, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. There is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But let's go even further. Do you know the story in the Bible where Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days, fasting being alone. Then who shows up? The devil. But what does the devil do? He offers Jesus control over the world. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And this I will give you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. All right, hold on here. The devil is offering Jesus power to rule the material world if Jesus worships him? Does that sound kind of familiar? The Gnostics believed the demiurge, the false creator god, was the one who created the material realm. He claimed ownership over it and demanded worship. If the demiurge created this world and the devil is offering the world to Jesus in exchange for worship, could they be the same being? Now, the Gnostics didn't spell this part out word for word, but come on. If you understand how they saw the world, the connection is screaming in your face. Now remember, the church, they tried to burn all this information, but now we're uploading it. So hit like and subscribe now to spread this information like fire, because this isn't just a channel, it's a revolution of the mind to wake up the world. And if you'd like to help out even more, consider becoming a member and check out my books and downloads on inner transformation. Links are in the description. But if you're still not convinced that the God of the Bible isn't who you've been told, did you know that human sacrifice is in the Bible? No, seriously. In the book of Judges, there's this guy named Jephthah who literally sacrifices his virgin daughter as a burnt offering to God. He makes a vow and then he kills his daughter to make God happy. Now, doesn't a burnt virgin sacrifice sound more like a satanic sacrifice in a Hollywood horror movie than something a god would want? Then there's this story that everyone likes to pretend is cute and inspiring, the story of Abraham. God commands Abraham to murder his only son to prove his loyalty. And sure, God changes his mind at the last second while Abraham's literally holding the knife over his son's chest, but come on, that's psychotic. JK, just testing you, LOL. Like, what kind of loving God plays a game from Saw with his followers?
I want to play a game.
And guess what? The entire foundation of fundamentalist Christianity is based on human sacrifice. And that's not me being edgy. That's literally what they teach. Jesus is called the ultimate sacrifice. He had to die brutally, painfully, publicly because God demanded it. And why? Well, because Adam and Eve took a bite of a piece of fruit. He's like some divine mafia boss weirdly obsessed with produce, going, someone's gotta pay. Now, I remember wondering, why would God need blood to forgive people? And the answer I usually got was, well, someone had to pay the price. Okay, but if God is the rule maker, why would he create a system where the only way to fix things is torture and death? It didn't make any sense to me. But the Gnostics, they saw right through that garbage. The testimony of truth says, if the Father would actually desire a human sacrifice, he would be arrogant. That says everything. If the true God, the Father of truth, the divine source, the infinite mind, actually wanted someone to die to make him happy, that wouldn't be God, that would be a tyrant, arrogant, petty, insecure, a narcissist, demanding blood to feed his pride. Well, the Gnostics said the real God doesn't want any sacrifice. The real God wants awakening. Now, doesn't that make a lot more sense? To these Gnostics, Christ is the liberator who comes into the world precisely to undo the work of that false god and to open our eyes, just like the serpent did for Adam and Eve. But wait, it gets even trippier. There's another secret scripture from the Gnostics known as the Secret Book of John, and it has another twist on this whole story. In this text, it's not exactly the serpent who enlightens Adam and Eve, it's Christ in another form. According to this text, the true God of light sent Christ to wake them up. And how did Christ do it? In the Secret Book of John, Christ says, I appeared in the shape of an eagle on the tree of knowledge so that I could instruct them and rouse them out of their deep sleep. And if that wasn't clear enough, in the same text, Jesus directly says, I was the one, however, who caused them to eat. In short, Christ woke them up. One text pictures Christ as a serpent, another as an eagle, but either way, to the Gnostics, Christ wasn't just some bearded guru floating on clouds and handing out fish sandwiches. He was a divine secret agent sneaking into enemy territory, this world, to pull off the ultimate jailbreak. But what's wild is that the testimony of truth doesn't just challenge who God is, it goes full savage mode on the people claiming to follow Christ. The foolish confess, we are Christians, in speech only, not in power, when they are in fact mistaken of who Christ is. Okay, now if your head is spinning a little, I don't blame you. This is a lot to take in. Snake Jesus, eagle Jesus, evil creator, what? All right, but hold on. we're not done unraveling this mystery, because we have to address another aspect of this Gnostic worldview that's just as radical: resurrection. And this is central. If the serpent in Eden represents Christ giving the knowledge that leads to life, what does Jesus' own resurrection represent? Okay, well, what's the traditional story again? Adam and Eve ate some fruit, God freaked out, humanity is now cursed, and the only way to fix it, God has to send his only son to be brutally tortured and executed like a criminal. Yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But wait, it gets better, because once you die, if you pass the test and believed hard enough, well, you'll get to come back later at the end of time with a resurrected physical body, like a glorified holy zombie. And for what purpose? So you can sing praises to God for all eternity. Yay? I guess? The Gnostics said, no, you're missing the whole point. They weren't interested in reanimated corpses like a Christian version of The Walking Dead. The testimony of truth says, some say on the last day, surely we will rise in the resurrection. But they know not what they say. For the Gnostics, resurrection was now, because it was spiritual. It meant waking up from ignorance and death while in this life. As another Gnostic text, the Gospel of Philip, puts it, those who say that they'll die first and then they'll rise are wrong. If they don't first receive the resurrection while they're living, they won't receive anything when they die. And the testimony of truth drives this home. Do not look forward, therefore, to the fleshly resurrection, which is destruction. They know not the power of God, nor do they understand the interpretation of the scriptures. Let's make this crystal clear. According to the Gnostics, salvation was not about literal death and resurrection. It was about dying to your old self and knowing your real self. Now, the testimony of truth says, this therefore is the true testimony, namely, when someone knows himself and God, who is over the truth. He, though, will be saved and crowned with an unfading crown. And right there, that's the Gnostic secret. Ready? Knowing yourself is knowing God, because your true self is a spark of the divine source, a divine being of light that forgot what it really is. The real raising from the dead is raising your consciousness from the deep sleep of awareness. Powerful stuff, right? It's almost like psychological insight in mythological terms. But how exactly do you get free? How do you break out of the trap of the mind? The testimony of truth says, they asked, how had they been bound and how they might free themselves? And they obtained self-knowledge of who they are, or rather, where they are now, and in what place will they find relief from their foolishness and obtain knowledge. In other words, they ask the right questions. Who am I? Where am I? What the hell is going on here? And that's what Christ helps you do. Not because you believe in him like a magic fairy godmother, but because it's the inner voice inside you that wakes you the hell up to knowledge. You become free from the inside out. But these are the ones Christ will convey to heaven, given that they have renounced ignorance and progressed to knowledge. It's not about dying and going to heaven. It's about ascending consciousness, rising from ignorance into awareness. That's what resurrection actually means. And this is all where it leads. Not the cross, not the altar, not the megachurch. Knowledge of the self. That's it. Listen to this line from the testimony of truth. He has achieved knowledge of the Son of Man. That is self-knowledge. This is the perfect life, that humanity knows itself by means of the all. The key is self-knowledge. To know what you really are. That's the resurrection. And that's the real second coming, when the divine light within you finally wakes up and remembers itself. Okay, but what the hell is the all? Like, is that God? Is it the force? Well, this is where things get really interesting, because when the Gnostics say the all, they mean the entirety of reality, not just the physical world, and not just heaven either. The all is everything. The source, the totality of being. The all isn't a guy in the sky. It's not a throne-sitting king with a beard. It's the ocean of awareness behind all things and the realization that you are it. The Gnostics are saying that you can only understand yourself when you stop looking at yourself as a little meat puppet with a name and a social security number, and instead start seeing yourself as a fractal of the infinite, a spark of the divine mind that's waking up to itself. You don't need to be saved, you need to be reminded. Okay, now before we go any further, we have to talk about something really important. Now, the Gnostics, they were pretty badass, but they did not get everything right. So there are some things that are just flat out not good in this book. Well, for one thing, it's extremely opposed to the body, opposed to sex, to pleasure, to anything physical. The testimony of truth literally criticizes the command, be fruitful and multiply, as if procreation itself is a trap, like having children just keeps souls enslaved under the archons. But let's be real. Seeing the body as a prison and the material world as evil is not the answer. In this particular text, there's also an imbalance in how they use symbolic gender, elevating the male as spiritual and casting the female as worldly. Now remember, it's not about literal gender, of course, but it still reflects a bias. But again, not all Gnostic texts are like this, and that's important to remember, because Gnosticism wasn't one unified thing. It was a whole spectrum of radical mysticism, and many of them had a much healthier view in this respect. In a book called On the Origin of the World, for example, the spirit is feminine, a powerful goddess of life who rises up against the archons. And in the Gospel of Philip, the male and female are unified as equals, symbolized through the sacred union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And the beautiful thing about all this is that we're not part of some dogmatic religion that replaces one rigid book with another. We can say, hey, you know what? This part is genius. This part, not so much. And that's okay, because we're all trying to figure out this life thing. And the people who wrote this, they weren't gods, they were seekers like us. And they had some mind-blowing insights, but they went wrong by trying to deny the shadow self instead of integrating it. And think about it, the testimony of truth is all about asking questions and examining things critically, even if the information is coming from a being that claims to be God. Now, how often are we told by authorities, religion, institutions, don't ask questions, just obey? But the Gnostic Christ says, screw that, know yourself. Christ's role is to challenge us to question. Think about it. Even in the Bible, Jesus was always challenging the religious authorities, broke Sabbath rules to heal people, and even flipped over tables in the temple. And in the Gospel of Thomas, it doesn't demonize the world at all. Jesus says, the kingdom is within you, and it is all around you. And that's what I resonate with. Not the kind of system that says, escape the world, but the kind that says, wake up and transform it. Really think about this, because it's important. If you see the world as a prison, you're not going to fight to change it. You'll run from it. You'll fantasize about floating off into some disembodied heaven while ignoring the very real suffering around you. And that's not enlightenment, it's spiritual bypassing. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw this clearly. He called this the Hinterwelt, the fantasy of a world beyond that was invented by those too weak or scared to deal with this one. He said that people used religion to devalue reality and to comfort themselves with promises of a better world instead of taking responsibility for this one now. But that's not us. As Neogenians, we're here to wake up inside the dream and then change it from the inside out. Just as we're meant to change ourselves, we're also meant to change the world, and that's the whole point. The rulers of this world love it when you're so distracted by escapism that you never change anything. So awaken spiritually, the resurrection within, but also honor the life you're living here and now, body, earth, and all of it. See, you're not just watching a video. You're part of a rebellion that started 2,000 years ago. We're the serpent now. You and me, everyone who's part of this, we're the ones handing out the fruit. So was the serpent in the garden actually Jesus? In a symbolic sense, yes. The testimony of truth doesn't explicitly say that word for word, but it's leaving you all the clues to make the connections yourself. The serpent brings knowledge, Christ brings knowledge, and it even says that Christ is the bronze serpent, which is also in the Bible. So connect the dots. But remember, none of this is literal. These are stories and metaphors for what's going on in your own mind and soul. While Christ and the serpent represents knowledge and the catalyst of inner awakening, the false creator represents our own ignorance. The Gnostics mythologized the concept of the ego or the shadow. The false god could be seen as a symbol for the false self or the blind ego that we mistakenly believe is our real self. The serpent or Christ figure then represents the inner voice of wisdom within us that subverts that ego and points us to something beyond. What about Adam and Eve? Eve represents the right hemispheric functions of the brain, the unconscious, and intuition, while Adam represents the left hemispheric functions, consciousness and analysis. So Eve has a connection to the divine. In other words, she's the first to taste the fruit. When she gives some to Adam, that represents our right brain intuition of the divine realm, Eve being given to our conscious left brain self, Adam, for integration and analysis. Our spiritual evolution, our resurrection, happens when we integrate knowledge, both intellectual and intuitive. So eating from the tree of knowledge was not a fall into doom, but the beginning of awakening. After all, without knowledge of good and evil, what are we? Yeah, we're innocent, but also lacking depth. We'd be like animals. The journey of life, with all its pain, is what actually carves our soul into something that can actually understand divinity. It's a necessary step for our spiritual evolution. And at the end of the day, the ultimate question isn't about reptiles, fruit, or ancient books. It's about you and your inner journey. So are you eating from the tree of knowledge in your own life? Are you balancing the Adam and Eve within you? Are you experiencing a spiritual resurrection here and now, waking up from the sleep of ignorance? And are you helping the world do the same? Okay, but there's way more to this story, because who really is that secret God above the God of the Bible? And then what are we really, and where did we come from, and how did we get here? Well, there's another Gnostic text called the Secret Book of John, and you have to check it out. I did a whole video about it, and you should go watch it right now. Check it out. It'll change the way that you see everything.